The fate of the Neanderthals is one of the greatest mysteries in paleoanthropology. However, the notion that Neanderthals simply died out, as if they passively faded into the cold winds of the Ice Age, is an intellectual dismissal of their true abilities and achievements, and it fundamentally misunderstands their strength as a species. Neanderthals were apex predators, master hunters, sophisticated toolmakers, skilled fire users, ambush hunters, and survivors of multiple glacial cycles over 300,000 years. To suggest that such a formidable people simply vanished erases their resilience, their intelligence, and the fact that they competed fiercely with modern humans for territory, prey, and resources. The archaeological record shows rapid disappearance in regions immediately after modern human arrival, site abandonment, and the replacement of Neanderthals by Homo sapiens in a pattern that mirrors complete population replacement in recent times. To say they merely died out is to imply weakness where there was none, to deny them agency in their own history, and to overlook the very real possibility, supported by genetic, demographic, and archaeological evidence, that in many regions they were wiped out by expanding Homo sapiens armed with long-range projectile technology. "42,000 years ago, in the Rhône Valley of France, the life of one of the last Neanderthals came to an end. It was the season of migrating herds, a time just before the brutal cold set in for the Neanderthals who made their home inside the high shelter of Grotte Mandrin. Beneath an overhang of pale limestone, Thorin stood at the threshold of the cave, looking out across the wide ribbon of the valley. Sunlight shimmered on the river below. The sky was cloudy, and snow fell on the forest and valley below. He was a veteran of 40 winters, his frame muscular and rugged. He had survived brutal cold, hunted mammoth and woolly rhino, and fathered many children. He was the king of this mountain, his grey-blue eyes scanning the horizon and red hair waving in the breeze. His people were some of the last of their kind, and they didn't mix with outsiders, especially not the newcomers to the region. Behind him, inside the cave, his wife worked at cleaning sinew with a stone flake. Their children were quiet, half asleep in the warm shadows. The fire crackled with the easy sound of a hearth that had been tended by hands like theirs for generations. It was early fall and food was plentiful. In the rhythm of the seasons, this was the time to gather strength, prepare hides, dry meat, as the first snow fell. Then the arrow came. How could a spear travel so far and so accurately? It rose from the opposite slope 200 yards away, a flicker so slight that only a bird might have noticed it. It made no sound at first, then a faint whistle cut through the heat-thick air. Thorin had just shifted his weight, ready to walk back inside, when the stone point struck his chest with a force no spear cast by hand could ever achieve. The impact pushed him backward. Blood spread slowly across the hides he wore. Sunlight glinted on the arrow shaft, impossibly thin, delicately made in ways no Neanderthal could have imagined. He crumpled to the ground with a gasp that echoed strangely in the still air. By the time his wife reached him, he was already gone. The Neanderthals' thrusting spears and short-distance throwing spears were no match for the long-distance projectile weapons. The Neanderthals' weapons were obsolete in this new world, even when they controlled the high ground. Modern humans had no need for these primitive, brutish savages. Unlike the Neanderthals that modern humans had met to the east, these Neanderthals belonged to a more primitive lineage, and their faces and customs showed this primitiveness. His killers wasted no time. They dragged his body away from the cave mouth. In the harsh tradition of frontier conflict, they may have severed his head and mounted it on a wooden stake driven deep into the earth outside the cave. There, under the autumn sun, his head stared out across the valley he had ruled all his life. The heat soon tightened the skin. The jaw and face slackened. Within days the mandible and face bones detached and dropped into the dust at the base of the pike. The cold wind dried it, bleached it, and soon half buried it beneath drifting grit. Months later, when all flesh was gone, the skull was taken as a trophy, but the jaw and teeth were left where they fell. What remained was sealed beneath rock, dust, and the drifting sediments of a long Provençal winter. By the time the winter storms had gone, the remains of this Neanderthal man lay deep under the dirt, awaiting rediscovery over 40,000 years later. Though speculative, this reconstruction captures a truth underlying the archaeology at Grotte Mandrin. Even if the precise moment of Thorin's death is unknown, the evidence recovered from the site tells a story of extraordinary conflict. Over the course of more than 10,000 years, Neanderthals and modern humans fought for control of this cave, this valley, and ultimately this region of France. It was not a peaceful overlap. It was not marked by slow blending or shared culture. Instead, the archaeological layers show a pattern of abrupt displacement, total replacement, and a near-total lack of interbreeding in the Rhone corridor. Mandrin was not simply a home. It was a fortress on a fault line between species. Thorin, whose genetic material was recovered from the cave and identified as that of a Neanderthal male, belonged to a population that had been marooned in genetic isolation for tens of thousands of years. His lineage diverged from the main Western Neanderthal population well before 50,000 years ago, perhaps as far back as 100,000 years. He carried signs of intense inbreeding, long homozygous stretches in his DNA that speak of a dwindling and isolated clan. His people were among the last Neanderthal groups to occupy southern France, and they held on to this landscape long after modern humans first appeared. Yet to understand why Thorin's death, whether by arrow or some other means, symbolizes the final phase of a long war, one must look more deeply at the archaeology of Mandrin and the wider region. The cave sits on a terrace that overlooks the Rhone, which served as the central artery of migration between the Mediterranean basin and the northern plains. Whoever controlled the cave controlled the valley. Its elevation offered a commanding view of animals migrating along the river, as well as any bands of strangers approaching from the south or east. The location was so strategic that groups did not merely pass through it. They fought for it repeatedly and in successive waves. The deepest layers belonged to Neanderthal hunters who thrived in the region during the Middle Paleolithic. They made Levallois points, shaped by a method that involved preparing a stone core so that a single strike would remove a sharp, well-formed flake. Above this lies a shockingly different layer, not Neanderthal at all. Around 56,800 to 51,700 years ago, a group of modern humans appeared. Their arrival marks one of the earliest known incursions of Homo sapiens into Europe. Their tools were astonishingly small, narrow points intended to be hafted onto arrows. They used bow and arrow technology millennia before it appears anywhere else on the continent. They lived in the cave long enough to leave hundreds of microliths behind, and then they disappeared as suddenly as they came. Almost immediately after this brief human occupation, Neanderthals reoccupied the cave. Their return was not a slow reclamation of lost territory. It was abrupt, complete, and lacking any sign of cultural exchange. They did not adopt the newcomers' miniature points. They did not use their tools. Their industry remained wholly Mousterian, characterized by the sturdy, close-range weapons that had served them for hundreds of thousands of years. For a time, the Neanderthals held their ground again. They lived in Mandrin through multiple climatic shifts and produced layer after layer of occupation debris. What happened to those first Homo sapiens is anyone's guess. Maybe they were killed, or they migrated elsewhere, or they were assimilated by other Neanderthal groups. But they managed to survive at Grotte Mandrin for nearly 5,000 years, so they were not a failed migration. They were small in number compared to the groups that would conquer Europe starting around 42,000 years ago, the groups that would take Grotte Mandrin back from the Neanderthals once and for all. Thorin belonged to a long Neanderthal reoccupation. His bones, including a lower fourth molar that preserved his genetic signature, come from the upper levels of these final Neanderthal layers. The evidence indicates he lived somewhere between about 52,000 and 42,000 years ago, with the strongest statistical weight falling toward the earlier end of that range. Yet archaeologists, excavating new Thorin remains in situ, have found that his bones lie high in the stratigraphy, suggesting he may indeed belong to the last few thousand years of Neanderthal presence in the Rhone Valley. Whether he died closer to 50,000 years ago or nearer to 42,000, he lived during a period of intense pressure, isolation, and encroachment. The idea that modern humans and Neanderthals lived together peacefully in Europe has become steadily less plausible. In the Levant, there is abundant evidence of interbreeding. Neanderthals and modern humans occupied neighbouring caves, left similar tools, and produced hybrid offspring. But in France and Spain, the archaeological record shows something entirely different. There is rapid replacement without blending. There is no evidence that Neanderthals adopted human tools, or vice versa. There is no sign of technological borrowing. More importantly, the Neanderthal genomes from France, including Thorin, show no admixture from Homo sapiens during the last 50,000 years. The clearest sign of hostility comes from the archaeological context. At Mandrin, modern humans arrived, displaced Neanderthals completely, and then vanished within a century. Shortly afterward, Neanderthals returned, as though reclaiming lost ground. In the subsequent layers, the same pattern repeats. The Mandrin evidence outlines a frontier that was not only contested, but violently unstable. Each occupation represents not coexistence, but dominance. One species held the cave until the other pushed them out. Beyond Mandrin, other sites reinforce this picture. In the Charente region of southwestern France, the Lezois site produced one of the most disturbing Neanderthal remains ever found. The mandible of an adult individual shows deep-cut marks, deliberate defleshing incisions, and evidence that the jaw was severed with precision stone tools. The pattern of cuts is identical to those seen in trophy-taking, ritual mutilation, or symbolic display. While it is impossible to know whether modern humans or Neanderthals inflicted these injuries, the mandible nonetheless demonstrates that interspecies violence in France was real and could be extreme. The speed of the Neanderthal extinction in France also argues for conflict. At sites like Les Cottes, Saint-Césaire, Arcy-sur-Curé and La Ferracie, Neanderthal levels end abruptly around 42 to 40,000 years ago. Within a few hundred years, modern humans appear in these same landscapes, often with toolkits that differ radically from anything used by the previous occupants. At a continental scale, the overlap between the last Neanderthals and the first Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens is narrow, perhaps as brief as 2,000 or 3,000 years. This rapid transition fits a model of direct competition, possibly violent, in which Neanderthals were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed by the new human groups entering Europe. Thorin's genetic story strengthens this interpretation. His genome reveals a small population, increasingly isolated, cut off from broader gene flow. He carries long stretches of homozygosity and a mitochondrial lineage tied to other late Neanderthals from the western half of the continent. He lacks any trace of recent admixture with Homo sapiens. These signs point toward a dwindling group, hemmed in by advancing human populations and grappling with reduced numbers, inbreeding, and demographic fragility. His ancestors may have encountered modern humans thousands of years earlier during the first incursion captured in Mandrin's Layer E. But if any interactions occurred, they left no genetic trace in Thorin. This strongly suggests that by the time he lived, Neanderthals in France were avoiding contact with modern humans or were aggressively defending their territory against them. The analogy of a 10,000-year war is not poetic exaggeration. It captures the pattern emerging from the Rhone Valley. Modern humans appeared, displaced the Neanderthals, withdrew, or were pushed out and returned thousands of years later to push Neanderthals out again. Each episode likely involved conflict, loss, and flight. Thorin lived after the first wave of Homo sapiens had vanished, but before the final wave arrived. When those later humans returned, around 43 to 42,000 years ago, they brought the fully developed Proto-Aurignacian culture, characterized by bladelets, bone tools, personal ornaments, and high mobility. These humans belong to a larger network of populations able to share ideas, distribute resources, and move rapidly across landscapes. In such a world, Neanderthals with isolated clan structures and limited intergroup contact would have struggled to compete. Thorin's death, whether by a human arrow or by misfortune, symbolizes the broader fate of his people. The final arrival of Homo sapiens in the region would have been a shock felt in every river valley and hunting ground. These new humans possessed technologies that gave them reach, accuracy and lethality beyond anything Neanderthals had ever encountered. Their long-range weapons allowed them to kill from distances far beyond the thrusting range of Neanderthal spears. Their numbers grew, their networks expanded. Their cultural flexibility allowed them to adapt to changing climates, experiment with new tools, and communicate ideas over vast distances. By contrast, late Neanderthal groups were shrinking, fragmented, and genetically isolated. Their territories were becoming increasingly compressed as humans expanded. In such a context, violence was not only probable, but perhaps inevitable. Thorin's final year stands as a testament to a world in which the old lineage fought desperately to hold onto its home, its hunting grounds, and its very existence. When the last stones fell across Thorin's teeth and jaw, the war for Mandrin was already entering its final phase. Within a few thousand years at most, the Neanderthals in France would vanish entirely. Their extinction would not be slow. It would come with the speed of a cultural and demographic tidal wave. Thorin's people, who had survived ice ages and predators, who had thrived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, would no longer be found in caves, on riverbanks, or in hunting camps. Their stories would be sealed beneath rock and time. The fall wind that once dried Thorin's jawbone now blows across a landscape occupied entirely by the descendants of the humans who displaced him. The Rhone still flows beneath the cliffs of Mandrin. The cave still looks out over the valley, silent and indifferent. But the sediments preserve the memory of a struggle that lasted 10,000 years. Modern humans and Neanderthals did not simply overlap in this region, they collided, battled, and replaced one another in a sequence of upheavals that shaped the history of the continent. Thorin's bones, sealed beneath a collapse of stone, remind us that extinction is not always the result of slow fading. Sometimes it is sharp, sometimes it is violent, sometimes it is marked by the fall of a single jawbone into the dust, a silent testament to the final moments of a people who once called France their home. Thanks for watching.